Hi everyone, Matt here from Proof Fly Fishing. Welcome back. In our last video we finished by installing the grip. We epoxied that in place and then cleaned everything up. In this video we're going to install the tip top. We're going to talk about how to align guides. I'm going to briefly run through how to kind of set up your rod wrapping jig and your tensioner. And then we're going to switch to a close-up and we're going to go over how exactly to wrap a snake guide. So first things first, installing the tip top. One question I always get is which side of the blank should I wrap the guides on? And there's some controversy out there. People disagree on this one, but I generally wrap on the straightest axis. So I'll assemble the blank and then I'll just rotate it until I find the straightest point all the way from the butt to the tip. Mark that plane with just some tape, and that's the side I tend to build on. You're going to hear a lot if you get into rod building a little bit about finding the spline of the blank. Now the spline of the blank is a natural resting position for the blank, and a lot of times if you talk to somebody who's been building rods for a long time, they're going to make a strong argument that you have to build opposite the spline. And a lot of these builders started building with two-piece rods where you could actually find the spline for most of the rod. In today's rods, usually 4 pieces the standard. They go all the way down to 7 piece for travel rods. On 3 out of the 4 pieces, it's pretty much impossible to find the spline. So a lot of builders today, myself included, don't really worry about it. Find the straightest axis, and that's the plane that you want to wrap your guides on. If you want to find the spline for the tip, you can do so. The way you kind of do that is put the bottom section on a solid surface and hold the tip with your finger like this and kind of roll it, and you'll feel it kind of snap into place. There's a natural resting spot for it, and when you bend it just a little bit and roll it, it's going to fall right into that place. So what you want to do is once you find that, put your finger on the top of it and then a piece of tape on the back side of that. So you want to wrap your guides, say on this tip section, on the bottom part, on this side down here that my thumb's touching. But again, that's only if you want to. You don't have to. I have not seen it really impact performance of casting, but I always get a lot of questions on it, so I wanted to cover it briefly. Installing the tip top then is a pretty simple operation. You can use a couple materials. If you want to use a 2-part epoxy, that works fantastic. Also just regular old super glue works good as well, and that's what I'm going to use today. So you want to put the super glue on the blank itself. Don't try to get it inside of the tip top. It's too small, it just gets messy and tends to get all over the place. So a very small amount of glue on the upper, I don't know, depending on the size of your tip top, 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch. And then simply grab your tip top and install it. Make sure it seats nice and deep. And once you're done there, just take a piece of paper towel or an old piece of a t-shirt like I'm using here and just clean off any excess super glue and you should be all set. Once that dries, it's not going anywhere. The nice thing about installing a tip top first is that it's now going to be our definitive reference for all the rest of the guides on this section. Another nice thing about building a 4-piece rod is that you don't have to align the guides from each piece to the piece above it. You can simply do that when you assemble the rod by rotating the pieces to make sure everything's lined up. Each piece functions by itself. So you really just have to, in this piece, maybe 3 guides, maybe 4, and you're all set. Simplifies the process quite a bit. Now, when it comes to aligning guides, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tape off where the guides are going to go. And it's a good idea, especially starting out, to tape up, just put a little piece, just a marker, placeholder, where each of the guides measure out. And what that's going to do is a couple things. if you encounter any issues, sometimes what you'll do, you'll have a guide that measures, and it'll measure right off the end of the ferrule. So you can just move it up a little bit to make sure the whole thing's off the ferrule. If you assemble the rod, sometimes the guide will measure and it'll be on the male section, the lower section, but it'll be too close to the ferrule. So when you go to assemble your rod, you can't get a solid connection because that guide is placed too far up. So by taping everything out, you can kind of make small adjustments up and down along the way to make sure everything is fitting as it should. Okay, so on this tip top, my first measurement is 4.5 inches. So I measure 4.5 inches down from the base of the tip top. You don't want to measure off the loop of the tip top because that's adding, sometimes an eighth if you're using a large loop tip top. Sometimes it's a little more than an eighth. So for accuracy's sake, we're just going to measure from the base of that tip top. So there's our first placement. It's going to go right there. What I like to do is grab a rod wrapping jig at this point and just kind of rest everything in there. We're going to use our outrigger here for a little extra support. And once we have that in place, we're just going to start by eyeballing the alignment. So the guide, I'm using this double-footed snake guide here. We want to align the center of that guide right over top of the placement tape that we've put down. So I'm going to put that tip top with the loop facing up, and I'm going to center that guide right over top of it. I'm going to remove my tape that marked the spot, and I'm going to use that same tape to go over top of the foot. In a minute I'll show you a close-up of exactly how this looks when it's taped up. But I'm going to tape one foot to start off with. And if you're just starting and that guide's moving around on you a little bit, and sometimes on the tip section it will, because it's so thin it's just going to want to flex a little bit. It's fine to use a second piece of tape. Just make sure you leave the tip of that guide, the guide foot, exposed so you can start the wrap up on it. And once you get to the tape, you can carefully peel it off and continue wrapping. So here's our guide. It's roughly aligned with the tip top. I just did it by sight as I was taping it on. So then what we want to do is take the individual section and hold it up, and you're going to look through it just like you're looking through the scope of a rifle. Close one eye, look through the guide that's closest to you, and line it up with the tip top. And then kind of move that blank up and down, left and right a little bit, and you'll be able to see if those two hoops line up. This gets easier. The first one's probably the trickiest, but the second one is going to be real evident because it has to line up with two guides in front of it. So that first one, I can see here that this one's a little off. It needs to go to the right just a little bit. So while it's still taped in place, I can make that micro adjustment to the right, can pinch my tape down. Let's take a look again. And now it's dead on with that tip top. Once we're done wrapping the guide, we're not going to wrap with so much tension that we can't adjust those guides just a little bit. So when you get done with a particular section, everything's wrapped, you're happy with the way the wraps look. Again, start with the bottom and check your guides. And if you need to move them just a little bit, that's not a problem. It's not going to impact the integrity of that guide later on. So that's pretty much it for aligning guides. We're going to go over a little bit more when it comes to before we finish, when we're prepping the guides to put thread finish on. We're going to do a final alignment, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The last thing I want to do today is talk about setting up our rod wrapping jig. The setup I use is pretty simple. It's nice because you don't have to mess with complex tensioning devices and movable posts. I mean, some of the rod wrappers out there, you'd think you'd need like an engineering degree to understand how to use them. But this is the SIG jig. I'll show you how this is going to work. It's going to cradle our blank just like so. And you want to basically center the guide between the two posts on the main jig. It's going to keep everything stable. It's going to give you plenty of room with both hands to get in there. And then we're just going to use a cup to hold our spool, otherwise it kind of rolls all over the place. And a book, this one's about, I don't know, 1.5 inches thick. So here's how it works. Pull some thread off the spool, drop it in the cup, open your book, maybe 1/3 of the way to start off with. You can adjust that as you go. And then that thread comes out of the book, over top of the blank, and then you're all set. The the book is going to provide the tension you need, and the cup keeps their spool from moving all over the place. So now we're going to switch over to a close-up, and I'm going to show you kind of in a detailed way how to start the guide, how to start the wrap, and then how to wrap the guides and a few things along the way. All right, we'll see you in a minute. Okay, we're back. I have a snake guide secured to a blank here. I've switched over to a fiberglass blank so you can see it a little bit better. A couple things I want to point out before we get started. One is, this is the guide tape. It's holding one side of the guide, but it's plenty strong to kind of secure the side that we're going to be wrapping on. As far as tools I have in hand, I've got my burnishing tool, which you'll see quite a bit, and then I also have a double-edged razor blade. And that's really all you need to get started. So our thread coming out of the book is right here, and it's coming over top of the blank, and I want to give myself about 4 inches past the blank, just so it's easy to manage. When you place the thread on the blank, put it about 2, maybe 3 widths of the thread away from the start of the guide. That's going to give us time to get the thread on the blank and before we climb up the foot. So the first thing we're going to do, over top the blank, position it where you want it, reach under the blank, and then pull that thread up. And where those 2 threads meet, it's going to cross over. We're going to take the tensioned thread right here, and we are going to rotate that rod slightly toward ourselves and push the tension thread over top of the loose thread that we have in our hand. And then we're going to do that same thing again. What we're doing here is trapping the thread below. For those of you who tie flies, this is going to be a very familiar knot. It's the same technique you use to secure a thread to a fly hook. So again, we're going to come under with the loose end, and where those 2 cross, we're going to rotate the rod toward ourselves just a little bit while pushing the tensioned thread over. And now our thread is secured onto the blank. Usually 2, sometimes 3 times, and you should be all set. Now we can take our burnishing tool and kind of pack things in place. You see we've got some gaps there. We're not going to worry about those too much because we're going to pack our thread as we go. Now here's the tag end. We're going to go ahead and leave that on for a few wraps. Sometimes these wraps will slip on you, so it never hurts just to kind of go over a few additional times just to make sure that that thread's not going anywhere. And you can see now we're up on the guide, right on the tip of it right there. And we're packing as we go. Now, when you start off, it's very easy to overlap the thread, which means when you're wrapping, this thread kind of gets pushed over and you get kind of like a double layer of thread. So one way to avoid that when you're just starting off is to kind of lead that thread. So you can create an intentional gap with your thread just like that. And then as you go, you can use a burnishing tool or your fingernail or whatever you have, and then close that gap as you go. That way there's no way you're going to get overlap in that wrap. So now we've got quite a few wraps on, so we're going to take care of this tag end. So we're going to hold it perpendicular to the blank. We're going to set our double-edged razor blade right on top of the wrap, and then with a slight sawing action, cut that off. Hang on to this piece though. We're going to use that a little bit later to tie off this wrap. And as I come around, you'll notice there's a small, maybe you won't notice, but there's a little tag end right here where I cut that. Don't worry about it, just go right over top of it with the other wraps and it'll disappear. So once you get a little more experience, you'll be able to just kind of rotate faster like that. And then once you get 4 or 5 wraps in place, you can just pack that thread nice and tight, because we don't want any gaps, we don't want that blank showing through in the final result. When you get to the point where your thread is about 5, sometimes 7 wraps away from where the guide foot starts to climb, so you get just a little room right here, what we're going to do is start to tie it off. Now, normally I just use the tag end that we cut off, but I'm going to use a contrasting thread to show you how this works. So take like a 4 or 5 inch piece of thread, and I want you to create a little loop with it, just like that. And that loop is going to go under the tension thread and just kind of pull it up onto the guide, just like that. And as I come around, you'll be able to see that a little bit better. Here's kind of the loose ends of that loop, and you can see it right here. And now we're just going to wrap right over top of that and continue packing that guide. Again, usually 4 to 7 wraps depending on the guide. I'm about to the end of that guide foot. So on this next turn, we're going to tie off. So here's our loop, here's our tension thread, and we've got the 2 loose ends of that loop hanging down there. So we're going to take our thumb and we're going to put it against the wrap, and what that's going to do is keep tension on it, because we're going to cut our thread now. So cut your thread close to the book, leave yourself plenty of room, and then grab that loose end and we're going to feed it right through that loop, just like that, and then pull it through. And I like to put it parallel to the rest of the wrap, that way it's nice and clean when it goes through. Then grab those 2 loose ends and we're going to slowly close that loop. We're going to pull on it, give it a little tug, and watch that tag end go right underneath the main wrap. Now it's tied off. So before we cut this tag end though, what I like to do is just give it another little pack, make sure our edges are nice and perpendicular to the blank, so we get a nice clean look to it, just like that. And when it's time to cut, just like we cut the tag end, we're going to hold that thread perpendicular to the blank, rest our razor blade right on the wrap, and with a gentle sawing motion, cut through that thread. You want to make sure you're using a real fresh razor blade. What you don't want to do is be like kind of hacking at that thread. That way you'll kind of get fuzzies if that happens. But that's pretty much it. That's how you do a main wrap. Now, one thing you'll probably notice is when you do a tip top, or excuse me, when you're wrapping the tip section, what's going to want to happen is that rod's going to want to flex on you quite a bit because you're wrapping on such a small area. And that's where you want to make sure that your jig is holding your rod as close as it can, so you can just have room to get your hands in there, and that's going to minimize the amount of flex you get when wrapping. So go ahead and wrap your guides. Take your time. You know, a lot of time, even today, if I'm like wrapping a guide, it's not uncommon for me to get all done, look over the guides and find some gap or an overlap or some mistake. So just rewrap it if that's the case. Now we can pull off this tape, and we can just wrap this side the exact same way. All right, I think that's it for today. In the next video, we're going to wrap ferrules. We're going to wrap just in front of the winding check, and I'm going to show you a technique for wrapping a stripping guide that might have a less than perfect foot. All right, thanks.